I would literally want you to know I just had a fight with my microphone because it keeps disconnecting, so here's hoping it stays connected for this video, because this is the all-encompassing important video of the year, obviously. You would think, after having this mic for 6+ months, I would know how to use it. But here we are. Anyways, hey, hello, hi. Hi guys. My name is Haley, and I'm here to film my favorite books of 2025, and I am excited about it, but also a little bit nervous, because I had a hard time ranking these, as always. I ended up doing a top 10, which is somewhat ranked, but not really, besides like probably the top 3, and then I ended up doing some honorable mentions, which I'm going to start with those. So we're going to hop right on into this and hope this video isn't 30 minutes long. But yes, we're going to jump right into the honorable mentions, and then we're going to get going. I also feel like I probably had the flu over the last few weeks, so if I'm a little low energy, or I'm pretending like I'm not low energy, that's why. But the first of my honorable mentions that I'm going to talk about is Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. I love Ali Hazelwood. She has some of my favorite romance book of all time. I went on a binge of her books last year, and I really, really like this one. It's probably one of my favorites of hers. And I apparently might be in the minority of that, because I know a lot of people did not like this one. But I liked it. I didn't understand there was a whole drama about, oh, she dated her friend's boyfriend, and I was like, I'm not sure that's what happened there. Maybe some critical thinking skills could be put into it, but if you didn't enjoy it, I get it. I don't understand, but I really like this one. It was on my top 10 for most of the year until it got booted out by a few other books towards the end of the year, but highly recommend. And then I have The Compound by, what is her name? Aisling Rawle. If I mispronounced that, I apologize. This I read while I was living in Vegas, and it was something I was going to read for like a 24-hour readathon, which turned into some weird other vlog that if you scroll a few vlogs back, you'll see it. And this also was right before / during when, am I allowed to say his name on YouTube? Charlie Kirk got shot. And I was filming a 24-hour reading vlog at the time, and I was like debating how much of my annoyance with that situation and how the internet reacted to it, and me delving into Christian nationalism and back into all of that because of it while I was filming this. But yet this book did not suffer from it. I still finished it like the very next day, trying to forget about everything, even though I ruined my own vlog by getting angry about how the internet handled that situation. I'm also just going to say I'm on the side of, he was not a good person. If you think he was, I think you have a fundamental misunderstanding of who that man was. And that's all I'm going to say on that soapbox. But I loved this. This is basically a reality dating TV show where people have to like survive until the end, but it also takes a really weird, almost horror turn. And I really, really enjoy it, and will be reading anything that this author puts out in the future. Next up is just the cutest Christmas romance that I read, and that is Holiday Romance by Catherine Walsh. I have been told by people for years to read her books, and I knew that they were all friends to lovers, and I was like, that's my least favorite romance trope, and I was like, I don't know if that's for me. I was wrong. They're for me. Her books are for me. Highly recommend. I understand that we're past the Christmas mood because this is going up early in January, but save this one for your TBR for December. It was really good. Next up was another one that was on my favorites for the longest time and just barely got beat out by a few others towards the end of the year, and that is When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. His book Mary was on my favorites last year. I think it was last year. And I was really looking forward to his new release, and it did not disappoint. This book is one of the most bizarre horror novels I've possibly ever read. And the way I keep describing it is, if you liked Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle, please read this. There is a somewhat similarity in the bizarro version of horror that it is. And it's the best comparison that I have. Because this story starts out with, there's this little boy that this woman finds running through the streets, and she's trying to help him, and she knows that he's being chased by this wolf. And the story takes a really strange horror turn from there. I really, really enjoyed it. It had some very, very heavy triggers for abuse, especially like abuse from a parent. So please be aware of that if you're going into it, but I highly recommend it. I give this 5 stars, and I really enjoyed anything that Nat Cassidy writes. And then I wanted to mention Say a Little Prayer by Jenna Voris. Is that her name? Yes, Jenna Voris. This is a girl who goes, she doesn't even on purpose. She is sent because she did something wrong at school or is being bullied or something like that and got in trouble. She gets sent to a Christian summer camp of her old church, which she has since left because of how they handled issues with something to do with her older sister and with her realizing she might be queer. So this hit really close to home for me, and if you are an ex-church kid who also realized you were queer, or just an ex-church kid in general, I highly recommend reading this, but also it will probably hit very close to home. And I remember that there's a line in here that really just hit me of, there was one girl at some point in the story that just goes, I didn't know you could be kicked out of church. And while most of us were not technically kicked out, that is mostly on a technicality. So I highly recommend this. It's a cute story, but very hard-hitting for those of us who get the religious trauma aspect of it. Then I have This Could Be Us by Kennedy Ryan. I read, I think, all 3 of these books in 2025, and the second one was my favorite because I loved the autism rep, the like kids on the spectrum rep. As somebody who works with kids on the spectrum a lot in my childcare career, this is the best representation I've ever seen of kids on the spectrum, and they did such a good job with it. There is also an adult on the spectrum in the story who is figuring out all of this as the story goes along. I also love the self-love journey that our main character went on, and this was by far my favorite of the trilogy. And I've loved everything that Kennedy Ryan has written and can't wait to read more. And then there's this next one that pains me not to put it on there, but I really wanted to round number 10 for my top 10 of the year. But this one was so close, and that is The Black Kids by Christina Hammonds Reed. This is the story, a fictionalized version of what happened during the 90s riots in LA over racial tensions. And it deals so much not only with the racial tension of the time and what was going on, but also the concept of we only really call them riots if they are by non-white people, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. And also she had an older sister who was much more socially aware than she was. They like grew up privileged, and the sister has since left. And it is this young black girl who is checking her own privilege for the first time in the midst of all of this political turmoil and racial turmoil, and it was so good. I have an entire vlog of me reading it. I'll leave a link down below. Highly recommend going and watching that if you want to hear me read out quotes. I'm not really somebody who reads a lot of quotes and stuff from books because I find it kind of cringy sometimes, but so many of them were so good and so important in this, and I cannot recommend this book enough. If any of these were going to be in my top favorites, it was going to be this one. The OCD wouldn't let me put anything else in the 10. And then we're going to jump into the top 10, and the first of those I'm going to go with We Have Reached the End of Our Show by Allie Gordon. I got to meet Allie Gordon. She is a member of Team Star Kid. If you've been around here for a while, or if you've been here even for a few months, I love Star Kid. I have loved everything that they've done over the 15 years that I've been following them. I've got to go see some of their shows live in the last few years. And when I heard a member of Star Kid was writing a book, I was so excited. When I heard it was sci-fi dystopian, so excited. And I got an ARC copy of her book, and I actually got to chat with her a lot, both before and after her show when I met her. I'll even put up the picture actually I took with her. She was so nice. She's so kind. She definitely kept in touch with me even after the book signing, and this is such a perfect little dystopian novel about this queer couple. And it is about one of the characters has a terminal illness, so trigger warning for that. And then one day they discover that the world is going to end. Like there's an asteroid headed for Earth, and it's going to annihilate the continent, not the continent, the planet. It is like literal apocalypse that is incoming in like 30 days, I believe it is, or like 20 some days. And it's all of our characters grappling with the idea of, oh, we know that the world's going to end and we have a little bit of time to prepare for it. And our main character, who has already accepted a death sentence, having had a terminal illness, is dealing with it in a very different way than our other two characters, who are just like now having to like realize the length of their mortal lives that are left, and they decide to go on a journey cross country, like as a road trip, as a last hurrah to hopefully get to Lacey, who is one of our main characters' parents, which is in California, and they are coming from New York City. My personal favorite character in this was Josie, who is one of the two main love interests of the queer couple, and he is a escaped Mennonite, which is an offshoot of Amish, if you didn't know. And there is so much religious trauma woven into a lot of the abuse that he encountered before he escaped when he was younger and moved to New York City and met his partner. And those portions of the book hit so close to home to me. It was also really, really fun that the road trip that they take over this is one that is very similar that I've taken many times going cross country. I was also living in Vegas at the time that I read this, and Vegas is one of the stops in the book. So it was a road trip I was very, very familiar with, having driven cross country with my partner several times. And I loved this book. I loved the experience of being able to go see Allie talk about her book and go to her book signing and meet her and everything. And it definitely deserved its spot on this list. Next up is Dungeon Crawler Carl. If you asked me which one of these was my favorite, I'm not sure that I could tell you. It's mainly the vibes of Donut and Carl's journey that I love the most. I want to say I was really in it once we hit like book 3. Like books 2 and 3 were probably the ones where I was like, oh, I love this. Even though the first one was very fun. But essentially this is a story of there are these aliens that have come to Earth, and anybody who was inside of a building or underneath something that had a roof was smashed when the aliens came, and anybody who was outside and not under a roof survived, and then they are offered the chance to go into this dungeon through these portals that appear wherever they were in the world, and they are put into a essentially RPG game where they like get an interface and how they interact with the world, which is a very fun concept to begin with. But the more that you read of the series, the more attached you become to Carl and Donut, who is a cat, who is a talking cat, and I love this series so much. I'm still saving the last book because I don't know when another book is going to be released, so this definitely deserved its spot on my top 10. Next up is another book that I read in one sitting, and that is The Favorites by Lane Fargo. I read Lane Fargo's other book. What was it called? They Never Learn. It's a thriller. It's one of my favorite thrillers of all time. So when they said she was coming out with a romance book, I was like, that's weird, but I have to check it out. This is the most addictive, most messy, drama-filled book I've ever read, and it's about 2 ice skaters. I'm not going to say much more than that. It is compulsively readable. I meant to start it, and I finished it in like one night in the span of like 5 hours. So, and it's a chunky book, so everything you've heard about this hype-wise is probably true. I loved it. I understand why it's on like everybody's favorites of the year. Another one of my favorites is Spark of the Everflame. If you were here in like March or April, when there was a lot going on in my life, I think it was even April was when we found out we were moving, which was a whole experience that like threw my life into turmoil for the rest of the year. In the span of like March and April, the only books that I read, other than a few nonfiction, were these books, because 1, they're chunky. 2, it is one of my favorite fantasies I've read in years. I also love to say that DM is one of the most relatable main character, especially fantasy main characters, I've read forever. I want to say the last time I had a fantasy-esque main character that I really related to was Paige from the Bone season, which was decades ago in my brain, probably close to 10 years ago when I first read those books. And this gives me similar vibes, but with a much cooler world, and there's like different realms almost mentioned in here. And I also loved our love interest. But I overall just think the world is so cool, and I love DM so much that this had to be somewhere on my favorites. Highly recommend if you have not read it, and I need the 4th book immediately. I'm not even sure if we have a release date on that one. But Penco, please. Please, I need it. Thank you. And we have Sunrise on the Reaping, which everyone and their mother read and sobbed over, including me, back when it came out. I also feel like this shot up a little bit more in my favorites because at the time that I read it, which is right when it came out earlier this year, I was like, oh, I really want to reread The Hunger Games. That never happened. And then in the last like 2 weeks of the year, my partner, who had never really seen or read any of these books as a kid as they were coming out in the dystopian craze of the early 2000s or like mid 2000s, I wanted to rewatch them, and he got really into them, and now he is currently reading Sunrise on the Reaping because he wants to go see the new movie later this year when it comes out. And it's just one of those things that I feel like we have bonded a lot over because he's really not somebody who reads fiction. And I also obviously love this. Haymitch's story is a story we've wanted from the beginning since the original trilogy ended, and it did not disappoint. I don't know how she shattered all of our hearts when we knew what the ending of this story was going to be. And I feel like that's talent. I also feel like Suzanne Collins is probably going to release another book within the next year, judging by the political climate of America at this time, because she usually writes books when she has something to say, and I'm sure she has a lot to say right now, especially with the Patriot Games thing that has been announced recently. We're about to be scolded for all those people who did thirst traps of snow when Ballad came out. But yeah, love this. Made me sob my eyeballs out. And speaking of sobbing my eyeballs out, Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not necessarily a Taylor Jenkins Reid fan. To be fair, the only book I had read previously was Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I did not enjoy it nearly as much as everybody else did. But I heard this one was also sapphic, which is the reason I read Evelyn Hugo originally. And this was a non-messy version of Evelyn Hugo. The reason I didn't like it was because I didn't like the main character of her other book. But this is the story of two women being involved in the space program in the 60s, 70s, at a time that it was not okay to be queer or more socially accepted in society. And there were so many quotes. I loved her love interest so much. The current chapters, or like the future current, whatever we're calling them, chapters, were so stressful because they're on a space mission. I was like sobbing. I also have a vlog of me reading this when we were living in Vegas, and I was sobbing my eyeballs out. And it hurt me, and therefore it is on my top 10 favorites of the year. And then we have another reoccurring author on my top favorites of the year list, and that is Andrew Joseph White's You Weren't Meant to Be Human. This book is one of the most horrific books that I've ever read. Not necessarily because there's like a ton of horror elements. It's because what this book is about is like my own personal horror. And that is like a pregnancy. I am terrified of pregnancy as a woman. And this is about a trans man who ends up pregnant and does not want to be, but is forced to continue it to term and is having a lot of body dysmorphia because of it. This book ruined me. It was horrific. And it is probably one of the worst books I've ever read, but also is going to be on my favorites because it scared the shit out of me, and that was the goal. I love everything that Andrew Joseph White writes, and I really want to go back and read his older novels, because it's been like a year or two since I read them, and I cannot recommend his books enough. And then we have another sapphic one, and that is Bloomtown by Allie North. I heard one specific YouTuber, booktuber, who reads mostly sapphic books, and I have a hard time finding sapphic books a lot of the time because I've read most of them over the last several, like 4 or 5 years. And this was one that I'd never heard of. I think it kind of went under the radar, and I feel like it started to get some traction next year, but needs more. And this is a historical lesbian fiction. And it's about this girl who gets on a train to go, like, I think she's going to see her husband, because this is back in like the Wild West times. And she gets kidnapped on the train by this other woman who has 2 kids with her, and it is her realizing that she may not be straight, and that was not okay in this time period. Also, Joey is one of my favorite main characters. This is a love interest. She is a very masked lesbian, and I love her so much, but I also love their relationship. I loved that our main character was a teacher. As a teacher, it was very relatable to me, even though this is in a completely different time period. And from henceforth, I will read everything that Allie North writes. Her new book just came out, and I haven't quite got around to it yet because I didn't want to have to add any more books to this list at the end of the year. So when it came out at the end of December, I was like, I'm going to wait and read that in 2026. So that will probably be read soon. And then we're on to our top 2, which I had a really hard time differentiating between. One, because one of them I read very, very early on in the year and was like, oh, that's going to be on my favorites, and also it's possibly one of the most horrific books I've ever read. And the other one I read very recently in the last month or two, but it was so relatable in the time period that it came out. So in the number 2 spot, we have Wake Up and Open Your Eyes by Clay McLeod Chapman. I read a book of his, I want to say it was last year, that I thought was okay, but I feel like I need to go back and reread it because I think it was right book, wrong time. Because that one was about the satanic panic. This one, if you can kind of tell from the cover, by it's like all these people with brains for faces. And this book is a horror novel about for lack of a better term, the fake news craze, and deals with, if you have ever, it doesn't explicitly say any of this, but it's a very obvious horror metaphor of it. If you have, in some way, shape, or form in your life, if you live in America, have lost anybody to the Fox News or a MAGA crowd, and you can handle a lot of horror elements, including like sexual assault and stuff, and like just gore, which is most of this book is. I had not been reading fiction because there was a whole ordeal where me and my partner were homeless for a short while earlier, a few months ago. And this was the only fiction book that I read in that time period. And I read it in the span of like 2 days, which is a big deal because I really was not reading at that time. And in this, there is this network program called Just the Facts. It's called Facts News, and it's supposed to be like Just the Facts, but it's very clearly a parody on Fox News. And it was horrifically relatable as somebody who has to deal with and seen people fall into the traps of fascism and MAGA that we are currently dealing with in the United States as of 2025 and now 2026. And it was so well done in this, and I loved it so much, and I went to read everything else by this author. I cannot recommend this enough. If you don't like gore, probably don't read this. There was a very, very explicit, like, horrific sexual encounter early on in the book that also, it seems, according to reviews, put a lot of people off, so please be prepared for that. But I cannot recommend this enough if you are somebody who is grappling with the fact that you have lost somebody to these, like, news outlets that are just putting out pure propaganda and they don't listen to reason anymore. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Please go read it if you think that is up your alley. I cannot recommend it enough. And then my favorite book of the year. This was really hard because I had 2 books by this author on my favorites, so I'm going to put a little shout out to Fire on the Rock. This is not my favorite of the year, but it is by the same author and is in the same vein, so please also read that one. But my favorite book of the year is Copper Sun by Sharon M. Draper. Sharon M. Draper is an author I've been reading since middle school, and I did not remember her name because at that time I didn't have Goodreads. I didn't really have a way that I was tracking the books that I was reading, which I've been doing for the last 10 or so years. And I read her series Tears of a Tiger in my middle school library as a kid, and I remember it viscerally sticking with me, and I really want to go back and read those ones this year. But I kept finding a few of her books in thrift stores earlier on in the year, and this was one of them. And this is a historical fiction. It is technically YA, but I wholeheartedly agree that anybody from any age range can get a lot out of this because it is a historical fiction of a young girl who gets kidnapped and put into the slave trade that comes back to the US. And there is a scene in this that has never ever left my brain because it was so horrifying, but also this book was so informative about things that I feel like I just never learned in school getting an American education, especially in Ohio, which, like, I feel like our education was a little bit better and a little bit more unbiased in the 90s, but we definitely didn't learn a lot of this. I will say, full trigger warning, because this is the scene that has never left my brain as somebody who works with kids, and I know people have a lot of triggers about kids. If you don't want to know what the spoiler is, know that it has to do with kids and it's horrific. If you do, please stick around for a second. If you don't want to know, skip forward like 30 seconds. I'm just going to say the word. But there is an instance of infanticide in this, and it was the worst scene I've ever read. So be mentally prepared for that if you go into this book. And this shows such a very real, visceral version. And this came out in the either late 90s or early 2000s when most of her books came out. And it will forever live on in my brain and set me on a whole journey of reading a lot of nonfiction on racism and such that I've been going through over the course of the year. But simply for that scene and for how much I learned from this book, this is my favorite book of 2025. I know it's very different from a lot of the other books, and it definitely also sent me on a historical fiction kick, which is how I read Boomtown, how I read Atmosphere. Like, a lot of my other favorites also were historical fiction because of my reading of this book. And I think it is such an important read for people who just were not taught a lot about this time period, especially in the current political climate where we're just not talking about slavery at all anymore in America because they think it is harmful to the white children. which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. But that's all I'm going to say on that. But yeah, those are my top favorite books of 2025. If you could interact with this video in some way, leave me the bookstack emoji, or you can also let me know what your favorite book of the year was in the comments down below. I'm trying really hard, even though I'm sick right now, trying really hard to get better at posting regularly and more often and more interesting videos in 2026, so I would greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe and interact with the video. It really helps the algorithm. I've been in algorithm hell for months now because YouTube really doesn't like that I changed my niche from years ago when I was in a Christian cult and I didn't post for 2 years, so any interaction is much appreciated. Thank you all for watching, and I will see all of you guys next time.